In February 1964, the Beatles brought optimism to America. Only 4 months later, the Rolling Stones arrived.
They made themselves an antithesis, really, of what the Beatles were in terms of image. The Beatles may want to hold your hand, but the Stones want to come and burn your town.
Rebellious, dangerous, druggy, sexy. That is the Stones.
But as peace and love spread from California, the Stones' tougher vision seemed out of place.
The Stones are hardened. They never fully bit on all the idealism of the 60s. We can transform things by smoking pot. It was just not realistic. In a sense, the Stones' vision was truer.
And then, within months of the Summer of Love, the whole world changed.
By 68, the darkness that was associated with the Stones definitely chimed with what was happening on the streets of Chicago and Paris and London. Blood was running in the streets. The temperatures were rising really fast. It was as if this is their time.
This film traces the Stones through this turbulent era, all the way to the Altamont Festival in 1969, the concert that brought the decade to a shocking end.
Much as there was an element of the Stones that loved chaos and loved disorder, they had no idea when they got into Altamont that it was going to turn out like that.
You've seen real ugliness and savage right in front of our eyes. The Hells Angels were horrible.
It's like a car crash. You can't do anything about it, you're just in it.
Things just went from bad to worse, and there was no control in it. It was probably one of the worst days of my life, ever.
October 17th, 1969. After a prolonged break from live performance, the Rolling Stones touched down in Los Angeles to begin preparations for the biggest concert tour of their career. Return to the American stage was hugely anticipated.
It was looked forward to as a huge event, a big event, and a lot was expected of it. People wanted to hear what the Stones had to say.
The Rolling Stones hadn't played in America for 3 years or so. Things had changed radically in that 3 years. When the Rolling Stones before were playing, girls would literally wet themselves and scream the house down, and the show might last 20 minutes before all 10,000 people rushed the stage. So the Rolling Stones were confronted with something which at first completely kind of freaked them out, which was audiences that sat there and wanted to listen.
Announced as the greatest rock and roll band in the world, despite a changed environment, the Stones' seminal performances became the stuff of legend.
Everybody was on fire. You know, you get the energy from a group and you get an energy from the fans. I'd love the fact that I could go and watch them every night, and it would be a little different each time, but it was great. The shows were spectacular. The boys knew how to perform.
In 1969, the Stones were incredible. They were brilliant. I mean, those shows were raucous. The Stones were the biggest rock and roll band on the road. You know, the Beatles had pulled back, Dylan had pulled back, but the Stones were out there in 1969, and coming to America in 1969 was no joke. The Stones were in the thick of whatever was racketing around in America at that time.
America in 69 is in a state of some turmoil. We'd moved on from the Summer of Love in 67, obviously. Things had got a lot darker, partly because of the Vietnam War protests. We've had the assassination of Martin Luther King and Kennedy. So there's a much darker mood abroad. There's still that air of hippie optimism, 69 is in some ways the high watermark of that, rather than the Summer of Love in 67, because this is the summer of Woodstock.
Held in August 1969, with nearly 500,000 in attendance, the Woodstock Festival was a momentous 4-day free concert that stood as a testament to the growing strength of the youth culture. In November, late in their tour, the Stones announced their own free concert on the West Coast. Originally to be held at San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, this event would eventually take place at a remote racetrack called Altamont.
Altamont was intended to be an expression of optimism and the strength of the counterculture, an event at which, all the tribes could come together. So on the surface, when it's first announced, this is huge news, and it's celebratory news.
The mythology of free concerts were at the absolute height in 1969. The whole phrase free concert was just redolent with all these ethics and images and ideas that were floating around the counterculture at the time. It could have been fantastic. Everybody assumed that they were looking at a mini Woodstock in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. That's not what it turned out to be.
The event itself would prove disastrous, a tipping point where the counterculture's dream of peaceful solidarity tragically fell apart. And the violence and chaos that the Stones came face to face with during this concert was a far cry from the seemingly calm America they had first encountered less than 10 years beforehand. And the band's own development across this decade interweaved with the changing currents of America's youth culture during the same period. America, 1962. A nation energized by a period of political growth and prosperity. Consumer culture was thriving. Advances in technology were transforming everyday life. And many felt that this was the dawn of a new golden age. The American dream alive and kicking once more. Yet an ever-present threat of war cast a shadow over this spirit of optimism. And beneath the confident surface, tensions were developing.
America in the early 60s is a strange place in many ways. In terms of popular culture, it's rather bland and anodyne. At the same time, politically, you've got Camelot and the court of JFK, and there's a certain optimism there that we've broken with the immediate post-war generation, and this is the start of a more youthful, more energetic, more forward-looking political life. Soured to an extent by the Cold War, soured by the Bay of Pigs and the situation in Cuba.
Almost half of the population in the United States is under 25 years old. And there was this sense of an inherited world that had a lot of problems. For the younger generation, growing up with the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation, all the material prosperity in the world didn't really go to their concerns. Things like community, or things like social justice, or spirituality. None of those things could be addressed by a roaring economy itself.
And in November 1963, the equilibrium of the nation was shattered. President John F. Kennedy, for many a symbol of optimism and rejuvenation, was assassinated in Dallas. The event stunned America, its youth in particular traumatized by the violence and chaos it seemed to represent. But early the following year, a voice of hope emerged, and it was emanating from distant shores.
The Beatles arrived within a couple of months of Kennedy's assassination, so they walked into a nation that was grieving really badly and was in a state of shock. And they appeared on Ed Sullivan, and immediately they put smiles on people's faces. It sounds glib and bland, but that's really what they did. It was medicine, what the Beatles did. You can't stress enough just how important their arrival was.
And the sudden stateside success of this revolutionary four-piece opened the door for dozens of other British bands to have a go at breaking America. Following in the footsteps of Liverpudlians Jerry and the Pacemakers, The Searchers and Billy J. Kramer, in June 1964, a London group arrived with a very different image and sound. Unlike their fellow countrymen, the Rolling Stones weren't about optimism.
There wasn't a sense of the latest band from England, that was the thing. It was, the British invasion, and every week it was the Searchers and the Dave Clark Five and Herman's Hermits and all this business. The Stones were something totally different. It just felt entirely different.
No one else was really trying to do what the Stones were doing. They were into the blues. They were into black music. And they imitated it. But they imitated it very well, and they got something of the essence. They weren't just playing on the surface.
But the Stones, singer Mick Jagger, guitarists Keith Richards and Brian Jones, bassist Bill Wyman and drummer Charlie Watts, found that their appeal was limited, and their first US tour proved a disappointment.
When the Rolling Stones first came to the United States in 1964, they were not greeted with tremendous acclaim initially. Their records hadn't hit the radio yet, and they came to Los Angeles, where they appeared on a television show called The Hollywood Palace, and the host was Dean Martin, and he said, these guys are going to get in a hair-pulling contest with the Beatles.
They were co-starring with Two Elephants, which kind of tells you what America thought of the Stones to start with. And Dean Martin, he laid into the Stones.
Well, I'm going to let you in on something. You know, all these singing groups today, you're under the impression they have long hair. Not true at all. It's an optical illusion. They just have low foreheads and high eyebrows.
They had the advanced publicity, they had the gigs, but America just did not see in the Rolling Stones what they wanted to see. They really wanted a second Beatles, and that's not what they got.
In contrast, their rise to the top in the UK had been meteoric. Having only formed in the summer of 1962, they quickly made a name for themselves on the London blues circuit and arrived fresh-faced in the British charts less than a year later. And where America was looking for another Beatles, the Stones' allure in their homeland had been built upon marketing them as the polar opposite of the Liverpudlians. Their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, carefully crafted this image. They wouldn't smile in photos. They would respond indifferently to interviewers. From the very start, the Stones were presented as rebels.
They didn't so much have a defiance as an insolence. It put the Rolling Stones on one side with the youngsters, and it put the establishment on the other side. They were really probably the first anti-establishment band.
There was a punk attitude, except we didn't call it punk at the time. We just called it loutishness or yobbishness. That applied to the Beatles as well, and John Lennon in particular, perhaps. And whereas Brian Epstein's instinct was then to tone that down, put them in suits and make them as respectable as he possibly could without completely losing their edge, Oldham's instinct was the exact opposite.
He definitely had a vision of creating a band, a gang, that was the opposite of the Beatles gang. I think they understood Andrew's vision. And I think when Andrew said, don't smile, be a bit surly, you don't have to, if Charlie doesn't want to answer, he doesn't answer. If he does answer, he just says yes or no. And he's sort of monosyllabic and cool.
What would you say? No, in the first relationship seemed to be much better.
What came out of it was a high degree of individuality, coupled with the nous that Jagger had from the very outset, the coolness that Keith had, and the extraordinary charismatic Brian, who was unlike, at that moment in time, unlike anybody I think you'd ever seen.
And the Stones' image perfectly complemented their music. After a couple of minor singles, their 1964 hit, Not Fade Away, captured the band's unique blend of blues and rock and roll. The sound that had made them a sensation on the club circuit now saw them ascend to the top of the British charts.
The Stones really were the first of the R&B bands to emerge. I mean, R&B originally came out of the jazz movement in London, the jazz clubs, and it was frowned upon a bit, you know, it was seen as a bit populist. Whereas the Mersey beat bands, obviously the Beatles, but then you had Billy J. Kramer, you had Freddie and the Dreamers, were very much melody driven. But the Stones had this dark American vibe. They didn't look to Merseyside, they looked across to the States, to Chicago and the inner cities. So it was really a new sound. There was nothing really like what the Stones were doing at all.
I want to tell you how it's going to be. You're going to give your love to me. I'm going to love you night and day. Well, you know my love and I fade away.
The Stones' music was very much a vibe. The hooks were all about rhythm. Whereas I think the hooks for the Beatles were yeah, 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 and harmonies. The Stones didn't really go in for that. Not Fade Away really crystallised that.
The Stones had that R&B bluesy edge. And of course in Jagger, they had this charismatic frontman. So it was earthier. Rock and roll had sort of eradicated its black origins and tried to make itself as white as it could possibly sound. And if you like, the early Stones put the black back into rock and roll, even though they were, you know, white, middle-class, suburban English boys.
After that, you had the chain of events that the Stones were suddenly good copy in the national newspapers. Oh, this is the dark version of the Beatles. They don't wash, all that kind of stuff. Not Fade Away was the song that did that. They were taking us on this rhythmic journey, and no one knew where that was going to end.
In October 1964, the Stones headed to the US once again. Now with hit singles behind them and a growing reputation within the youth market. This time, they were invited onto Ed Sullivan's television show, which had helped launch the Beatles nationwide at the start of the year. And the generational divide that the band had opened up in their homeland was immediately replicated when they arrived on screen.
The Stones' appearance on Ed Sullivan in the newspapers, everybody was complaining about because Mick Jagger walked on stage in a sweatshirt. You know, no one did that on the Ed Sullivan Show.
The joint was rocking, going round and round.
Jagger just walked out on that stage like he was in a club. The second you saw him, you knew that this was crossing the line in an outrageous way. Jagger was singing in a kind of black American accent. It was very sexual. And by that point, the Beatles had become sort of a novelty as far as parents were concerned. You know, you got patted on the head for liking the Beatles. You didn't get patted on the head for liking the Rolling Stones.
The older Americans reacted with complete dismay without understanding why, although instinctively they were completely correct because the British were here to replace old-fashioned American show business, and that's exactly what they did. So long, Toady Fields. It presaged what came to be called the generation gap, where the American adult population became really threatened and intimidated by their children.
And these children were impressed by what they saw on Ed Sullivan. This time, with the performance mainlining the band directly into homes across the country, the Stones were instantly elevated to the very top of the music world. And as their audience grew, so too did the unruly, frenzied atmosphere of their live shows. More than any of their contemporaries, the Rolling Stones inspired chaos.
There were a lot of riots, but the riots were more so, I think, the fans trying to get close to you. You know, Mick had a control usually, and the minute you knew they were coming over the stage, we'd run back to the dressing rooms and lock it down. There was not as much security, but the doors kept it, you know, clear. No kids were pushing through at that time. But it was scary.
The Stones appealed much more towards the boys than the Beatles had done. The Beatles encouraged the screamers. The Stones invited the boys to participate as well. There was something
bit more butch about the Rolling Stones than there was about the Beatles at that time.
Whether it was the beat, the rebel look, young men turned up at Stones concerts. On the continent, for example, Paris and Holland, there was serious rioting, male, masculine, macho rioting. It was just like rock and roll again, smashing up the stalls, fighting with the police.
It wasn't just the fact that it was the boys looking for a punch-up. It was the media, to a large extent, that built up the expectations of the gig quite often. The security people just didn't know what to expect. When somebody tells you that the Rolling Stones are coming to town and there's going to be a riot, you prepare for that eventuality just in case. Security in the audience was a massive problem, which ultimately saw its nadir in Altamont.
But these outbreaks of disorder did not dampen the mood of optimism back in Britain. By late 1964, a cultural and artistic revolution was underway, with a change in political leadership bringing a new sense of purpose and vitality. Youth was in the driving seat, and the nation's capital, London, was becoming a hotbed of creativity and innovation.
After the Beatles, it was all eyes on Britain, but particularly all eyes on London. Suddenly, filmmakers, the fashion world particularly, were gravitating to London and seeing London as a city of culture. It was very, very different. The old idea of Britain as an old-fashioned, almost militaristic, historical establishment symbolised by the Queen, the royal family. We're having new aristocrats now, and they were, from the lower orders. You had Julie Christie, Jagger, Ringo Starr, Michael Caine, Terence Stamp. This was London in 1964-65. It was the place where everyone wanted to gravitate, and it was the place that was pulsing more than any other city on earth.
In America, however, things were very different. Although the coming of the British bands had energized the nation's youth and revolutionized the entertainment industry, the shadow of violent conflict loomed large. At the time of John F. Kennedy's death, there had been a number of military advisors in Vietnam, aiding the government in the south of the country against a communist insurgency from the north. Where Kennedy had been keen to contain this involvement, his successor, President Lyndon Johnson, escalated the conflict and committed US forces to a ground war. By 1965, thousands of young American men were being called up to military duty and sent to Vietnam, and the president immediately emerged as an enemy of the growing youth culture.
History does not favor a single system or belief unless force is used to make it so. That's why it's been necessary for us to defend this basic principle of our policy, to defend it in Berlin and in Korea and in Cuba, and tonight in Vietnam.
Vietnam certainly did more than anything else to politicize the generation gap, and the reason he escalated it when he did was that he made the terrible mistake of thinking that Southeast Asia was a replay of Europe in 1938, and we were reminded over and over again that we must never make the mistake of Munich made by Neville Chamberlain. The two things actually had nothing to do with each other, but unfortunately they became an excuse to send 500,000 American soldiers to Vietnam in a completely hopeless cause.
The draft that supported that war was incredibly unpopular. Again, 90 million Americans under age 25. Many of them know people that are getting drafted and serving and dying in some cases. So the war was extremely controversial. And there's also an important point that young people were more alert to. And that was that the explanations about the war, its origins and its development, were not truthful. This is much more than a political issue. It's an issue of trust.
And as the war quickly escalated, protests broke out across the nation. Young Americans joined with peace activists to organize large-scale demonstrations and marches, while at academic institutions, students became a powerful voice in the fight against the war. With the young now actively involved in a conflict with an older generation they perceived as violent warmongers, the music that had re-energized their lives became bound up in this struggle.
As people began to protest the war, and civil rights protests were taking place. Rebellion in the cultural arena began to take on that tinge. So what seemed just like the Rolling Stones' kind of surliness suddenly had a political element. The generation gap and the don't trust anyone over 30 and all of those kind of ideas became politicized, so that it wasn't just, the kind of Marlon Brando, what are you rebelling against, what do you got? Well, we got plenty. There's plenty to rebel against.
And in the summer of 1965, just as President Johnson announced he would double the number of young Americans called up for active duty, and as race riots erupted in the Watts neighborhood in Los Angeles, the Rolling Stones released I Cant Get No Satisfaction. The song perfectly captured the spirit of their generation.
Satisfaction really was the record that they didn't realise it, I don't think, but it was the one that they were working up towards. It was the one that embodied their attitude, it embodied the drive, and you only have to listen to the rhythm of that. It was like a marching, almost a marching, pounding beat. And it was the march of youth, the march of the younger generation. And then you add the lyrical content on top of that. I Can't Get No Satisfaction. The Stones, and that record particularly, was the one in summer of '65 that embodied everything that the young people were kind of striving for.
I Can't Get No Satisfaction became a kind of generational anthem. And it's an amazing performance. I mean, it's a definitive guitar line. But also, like, Jaggers' performance, by the time he gets to that last verse, I'm riding around the world, Jagger is very underrated as a singer, but when you isolate his vocals and you hear the kind of commitment that he brings to his delivery, there's a reason why the second you hear that song, you never forget it. The sense of young people feeling that kind of disgruntlement with mainstream culture, that was very much in the air right then, and they gave it voice.
Over the next year, the Stones' sound would expand, and the singles following Satisfaction took aim at the dark underbelly of British culture. And at the same time in America, a new dawn was beginning, one that would have an enormous impact on the Stones and all of their contemporaries. In distant San Francisco, an artistic, spiritual, and cultural scene had been growing since the 1950s. And its introduction of new music, mind-expanding drugs, and alternative lifestyles was about to change the world.
San Francisco has been a home for the tragically disaffected since the Catholic missionaries showed up here in the 1700s. Hospitable to radicals, rebels, mavericks. It attracted these original sort of disaffected free thinkers of the 50s, of the post-war era, and it was common knowledge to them that their parents didn't understand them. And one of them was a writer by the name of Jack Kerouac, who constructed an epic book on the road of two just such characters making a journey across the country, and their destination is San Francisco. On the road, settled San Francisco as the capital of this kind of thinking.
The main thing that touched off this kind of activity, I think, is the arrival of the Beats, the arrival of Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. And then in short order, you get figures like Ken Kesey.
A decade younger than the Beat writers, celebrated novelist Kesey introduced the bohemian community in San Francisco to a new drug, LSD. And this would play a pivotal role in the cultural scene that soon developed.
Ken Kesey had made his money as the author of One Flew Over the cuckoo's nest. He'd been introduced to hallucinogenic drugs via a government-backed experimental testing program, and then he becomes the link really between the beat generation of Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti and the emerging hippie movement of the mid-1960s. So he's a pivotal figure. He puts together what came to be called the acid tests, which were multicultural events, experiences at which LSD was liberally and freely circulated, and at which the Grateful Dead became the house band.
The Grateful Dead play there, they become part of that scene. The house band, they weren't really concerts, but the Grateful Dead were there. Sometimes they didn't even play. They were too high to play. And no one came there to listen to them anyway. So it gave them a fantastic opportunity to develop their music in the way that they saw fit.
In early 1966, this musical offshoot of the LSD parties began gathering momentum. Alongside the Grateful Dead, bands such as the Jefferson Airplane and Big Brother and the Holding Company developed on the local club circuit, creating psychedelic sounds that complemented the acid experience. At the premier clubs, the Fillmore West and the Avalon Ballroom, from these experiments a new musical culture was born, far from the controlling hands of the commercial entertainment industry.
At the Fillmore in Avalon, there were no spotlights. There was a big light show that covered the back wall and the side wall. And it was not an exact science. It covered parts of the floor, too, and people sitting on it. It was just this huge pulsing set of colors coming out of light projectors and film loops. And there was no spotlight. There was no band on display. And the stages were very low, like 12, 18 inches off the floor. And these crowds danced. They danced to the music. They didn't sit there and watch like a concert.
And the culture that started in the clubs soon began to spread out into the neighborhoods and public spaces of the city. With its epicenter in the Haight-Ashbury district, free concerts were soon organized, with the Grateful Dead and other bands playing to large crowds, both on the streets and in local parks. By the end of 1966, the hippie movement was in full flight.
What's happening in San Francisco is driven by a very democratic impulse, that it is non-commercial, so you have the free concerts. I mean, the drugs are also very, very important. LSD is still legal in 66, don't forget. And it is a tool of liberation. And suddenly, drugs are not just about getting out of your head, they're about expanding your head, expanding your mind. And so that goes along, I think, with the democratic impulse and the love and peace and those sort of pseudo-political, philosophical notions that underpin the hippie movement.
And while the key concepts of love and peace were central to this new San Francisco counterculture, at the free concerts, another group of nonconformists were often seen rubbing shoulders with the hippies. The Hells Angels, a Californian biker club, were similarly looking to live by their own code. An outlaw presence across the state, viewed by the authorities as a violent criminal gang, they had come into contact with Ken Kesey and the burgeoning counterculture at an early stage.
Kesey tamed the Hells Angels. He had them come over to La Honda, filled them with LSD, and hung out with the pranksters, and they were tamed by him. They loved him. They loved LSD. They got that whole thing.
Pretty soon the Hells Angels are fixtures at the Grateful Dead shows, and people start getting used to seeing them. And in fact, they can be quite helpful, sometimes reconnecting lost children with their parents. So it wasn't unusual to see them at some of these events.
The counterculture and the Hells Angels were sort of decent bedfellows because sex, drugs, rock and roll. Living the fast life, living life on the margins of society. There's an affiliation between rebellion and men on motorbikes that goes right back to Marlon Brando in The Wild One. On their bikes, they expressed freedom going up and down the freeway. This is on the road, except they're on their iron horses, so to speak, you know. But I think there must have been a wariness because the Angels lived kind of a different life. They didn't subscribe to love and peace.
For more than a year, this new counterculture, coexisting with the Angels, had been able to grow organically with little media attention. But in January 1967, a far larger free concert was organized. Known as the Human Be-In, it featured speeches from prominent figures Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg, alongside musical performances by the major new voices on the scene.
The Human Being was a huge event because it was the first one of its kind. You hadn't seen this kind of a huge crowd of countercultural people until the Human Being. So its example was extremely important.
It was made for television. It sort of is a signal to the national media that something interesting is going on in San Francisco's youth culture. The people who are on stage and speaking are also made for television. You get Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg in these kind of flowing robes, Leary spreading his message about the benefits of psychedelics.
6 words. Turn on, tune in, drop out.
I don't think word leaked out much about what was going on in San Francisco through the course of 1966. But with the Human Being in January of '67, it just exploded at the beginning of that year, and the mythology was instantaneous. Harry Reasoner showed up, the American TV journalist, and clucked about the hippies. They think they're some kind of saint, you know? And in doing that, it delivered a coded message to young people everywhere that it wasn't as repressive, it wasn't as gray, that there was hope, and that you could go to San Francisco, grow your hair, and things would be different.
While across America, young people flocked to the Haight-Ashbury district in search of this utopia, in Britain too, the influence of San Francisco was soon felt. Countercultural ideas and fashions crossed the Atlantic, while touring musicians, including the Stones and the Beatles, were introduced to hallucinogenics by their American counterparts. Talk of the new drug LSD in particular led to fears that popular culture was getting out of control, where only 2 years beforehand, the administration of Prime Minister Harold Wilson was celebrating the Beatles and the booming youth movement. Now a backlash began. Where once leniency had prevailed, now a number of drug busts were organized, and in February 1967, the police arrived in force at the home of Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards.
Pop stars had soft power, they had cultural power, and what they were saying was increasingly disobedient. But of course the establishment didn't like that, and they increasingly took notice of pop stars and what they were saying. And the Stones really were ideal candidates then for drug busts. When they started to clamp down hard, which was February 1967, the Stones were marked men.
The police were given a tip-off by the News of the World that a drug party was taking place at Keith Richards' home in West Wittering in Sussex, and they raided it on a Sunday night in February. This was the famous bust where Marianne Faithfull was dressed in nothing but a fur rug. All they found was some ash from a marijuana cigarette in an ashtray, a few amphetamines that were actually, I believe, on prescription. And the outcome was that Jagger was sentenced to 3 months in prison for the pills, and Keith Richards got 12 months for allowing his home to be used for this nefarious drug taking.
Personally, I was upset for them and very shocked. We were all instructed to be very, very low key, not to talk to any media. There was a sort of blanket instruction from the Stones office to not do anything to exacerbate that this was a serious situation. And so we were all, definitely upset and distressed and worried for them.
While these arrests further enhanced the Stones' rebellious reputation, They also sidelined the band for much of the counterculture's watershed year. While awaiting trial, they performed a European tour, their last series of shows for more than 2 years. And in May, Brian Jones was also the target of a police raid, and he too would stand trial for drug possession. On America's West Coast, however, the counterculture's influence spread unobstructed. And in June 1967, the first major pop festival took place in Monterey, a coastal city 100 miles south of San Francisco. It would prove a vital showcase for the bands of the Haight-Ashbury.
The San Francisco scene was very excited by this. We could feel this was the next wave. And so we wanted to, so then if we hadn't heard of them, now's the chance to see them. Now's, go down and spend 3 days and see them all.
Monterey, incredible, important transition, catalyst for huge change, and people came in that weekend on the top. Mamas and Papas, 6 straight top 10 hits, The Association, Simon and Garfunkel. By the end of the weekend, everybody was talking about Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, Otis Redding, Big Brother and the Holding Company. And the whole world had revolved in 3 days.
Monterey was the first of the pop music festivals, and it had a great feeling about it. I mean, there was a lot of optimism in the air, along with the smell of marijuana. And for me, watching that festival, the highlight was Janis Joplin, because I'd seen Hendrix and I'd seen The Who. I knew how good they were. I'd flown out with Hendrix. But when Janis Joplin came on that stage and opened her mouth, I just took 2 steps back. I just never heard a woman sing like that in my life.
Everyone was there. Derek Taylor from the Beatles publicist put this whole thing together, and a lot of people were there, so a lot of people saw her kill it. I mean, she was great that night.
Rather than being at a relatively small, semi-provincial American city, all of a sudden San Francisco was challenging LA. LA was the West Coast center of popular music, the movies, and all that was all LA. And San Francisco had very little part in that. But now, the Grateful Dead was San Francisco. Janis Joplin was San Francisco. San Francisco that summer became a pop music capital where it had not been before.
And in attendance at this historic festival was a Rolling Stone. Brian Jones, still awaiting sentencing, had traveled to the event, keen to witness firsthand the fruits of this new counterculture.
Brian Jones appearing in the audience at Monterey Pop, hanging out with Nico, was important to the scene. They recognized that as, British rock royalty anointing the festival. So the Stones were represented there. It would be the underpinnings of what would lead them into Altamont, because they felt somewhat separate from this hip underground movement, and they really wanted to be part of it. Jagger especially wanted that for his band.
But it was neither the Stones nor the West Coast acts who would provide the definitive musical statement of this new countercultural mindset. In a remarkable creative surge, with the LP Sgt Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the single All You Need Is Love, it was the Beatles who captured the spirit of the Summer of Love.
1967 really was owned by the Beatles. There was all this thing happening over on the West Coast, but All You Need Is Love, it was so right for its time. A summer of love that was, like all the best flowers, they just die off after a couple of months. But All You Need Is Love was the single song that symbolized that. They also had Sgt Pepper on the album market, which, you had reviewers in the Times saying, this is genuine art. This isn't pop music, this is art.
In my whole career of following music, and now it's 50, 60 years, there was nothing ever, and there hasn't been since, something like Sgt Pepper. This was big. Sgt Pepper blew everybody's mind. Everybody found something to like in it. And it was powerful, powerful music.
In late July, Jagger and Richards successfully appealed against their convictions, and the pair were free men once again. Determined to keep up with the Beatles, the Stones quickly reassembled and issued their own contributions to the Summer of Love. But the single We Love You and the album that followed, the much maligned Satanic Majesty's Request, offered a less celebratory vision of the times and failed to chime with the utopian mood of the era.
The Rolling Stones and Peace and Love might seem unlikely bedfellows, but, you know, Jagger and Richards were there at the recording of All You Need Is Love. And in fact, their single, which follows that, We Love You, I think is a masterpiece. The Rolling Stones are, and Jagger and Richards in particular, are right in the firing line at this point. So Peace and Love with an edge, because they are being targeted and victimized.
It wasn't anything like All You Need Is Love. It was sardonic, it was ironic almost, the way they sang that. It wasn't inclusive and upbeat and playful and fun and international, so the Stones weren't really playing ball.
The Stones are hardened. They never fully bit on all the idealism of the 60s. They were tougher. It was like a London thing in part. They were city kids. You know, so all of this get back to the land and, you know, wear flowers in your hair and all that business, that didn't really work for them so well. They didn't think, you know, because you went to the park with your friends and waved a flag around that anybody was going to give up anything important. They totally understood that that was never going to happen.
And the Stones' reluctance to join in with the prevailing optimism was borne out by the more disturbing events that occurred during the Summer of Love. In June 1967, 10,000 peace marchers were violently attacked by police during a demonstration in Los Angeles. While the following month, race riots erupted in Detroit, leaving dozens killed and hundreds injured.
Even as the Summer of Love was proffering this kind of vision of a new world, there were plenty of problems, and everything didn't disappear, because you took a pill one day. We can transform things by, smoking pot. It was just not realistic. And soon everyone learned how unrealistic it was.
The growth of the counterculture occurs at exactly the same time that the Black Ghetto is rising up in force in Detroit and in many other places. So you have these two simultaneous, not exactly related movements, but both of them give you a feeling that everything is changing and a lot of things are under siege in a way they never were before. But certainly the riots in the Black Ghettos are the most destabilizing force in the country and the one that terrifies white people the most, even more than long-haired rock and rollers, clearly.
The stage was set for harder times to follow, and at the very start of 1968, the counterculture's faith in the authorities crumbled even further. Victory in Vietnam was always presented as a certainty, the inevitable end to a just crusade. But the news reports that broadcast during the Tet Offensive offered all of America a very different vision of the war.
William Westmoreland, who's the commanding Army general for the United States in Vietnam, has come home to America in the fall of 1967 and said that the war is being won and that we have nothing to worry about and that we're about to turn the corner. And of course, famously, there is light at the end of the tunnel. And then at the end of January of 1968, you have every major city in South Vietnam and every major military outpost attacked simultaneously in honor of the Tet holiday. And you have Vietnamese, including some who had worked for the American embassy, inside the American embassy attacking it And those images of people inside the embassy compound, as well as the general mayhem around the country, have a very dramatic and immediate effect.
It was very clear that the light at the end of the tunnel just really didn't exist. That was a fantasy that was being sold to the American people to justify their sons going over to fight this war. Once that became part of people's awareness of what was going on in Vietnam, yeah, the tide began to turn. But there was resistance to that. My country, right or wrong, that was something you heard all the time back then. Even if Vietnam was not justifiable, you had to get behind it. And, young people who were kind of expected to go fight that war were thinking, well, I don't think so. I don't see it that way. The battle was on.
And this battle was not restricted to America's home turf. The youth and peace movements were active internationally, and in Europe, large demonstrations were organized to oppose the Vietnam War. And although Britain had seen peaceful marches for nuclear disarmament since the start of the decade, in March 1968, outside the US Embassy in London, the protests descended into violence.
After the flowers had wilted, there was a reality check, and the reality check, Vietnam was becoming an issue that spread amongst young people right around the world. It was the Cold War really getting out of control, Vietnam. Young lives were being lost, and people were asking questions as to why. Britain wasn't sending the forces over, but there was some tacit support of the USA.
And amongst the protesters, observing as the police and the demonstrators clashed, was Mick Jagger himself. Since his trial, the frontman's role in the counterculture had been transformed, and he now positioned himself on the front lines.
Jagger's very interesting in terms of his role in the counterculture, because there is this instinctive desire just to be yobbish and put your two fingers up. But he's also got this LSE education. He is attracted by some of the intellectual ideas that are underpinning these notions of different ways of organising society. And he starts appearing on British TV, debating with Malcolm Muggeridge and Mary Whitehouse and these figures who represented a really reactionary attitude at the time. The opportunity to go on TV and debate why he felt society was being organised on the wrong lines was very attractive to him. And then it becomes part of his songwriting as well.
And this would come at a perfect time. The confrontational mood in Europe was further escalated in May, when student riots erupted in Paris. The resistance soon spread to the French workers themselves, and the streets became a battleground, with protesters calling for a revolution. Into this turbulence came the Rolling Stones' new single, Jumping Jack Flash.
You had Grosvenor Square, but you also had activism in Berlin, in Paris, and youth was becoming an international force in a way like that. And the Stones, when they got their kind of mojo back to the tough R&B, they were great symbols for that. So when you had the Beatles in '67 embodying everything that was happening then, the Stones were poised really to embody the darker energies that were kind of unfolding during '68.
I remember the first time I heard Jumpin' Jack Flash, just thinking like, wow, the Stones are back. Driven by a riff and driven by a kind of rebellious message. It was exactly, what that moment seemed to call for.
That started them off. It kicked everything off with the Jumping Jack Flash. I mean, born in a crossfire hurricane, and all of the language that was in that thing, it was like identifying for all those people, felt like, life was crazy. You had Vietnam was coming, all these other things going on. So yes, born in a crossfire re-kicked everything and rekindled it.
But where the Stones were being revitalized, the American political landscape was reeling from further tragedies. In April, civil rights leader Martin Luther King had been assassinated, sparking off riots in more than 110 cities, the greatest wave of social unrest the country had experienced since the Civil War. Despite the turbulence, there was one political figure who offered hope. Robert Kennedy, the younger brother of slain President John, was a leading candidate for the Democratic Party to succeed Lyndon Johnson. An advocate of human rights and social justice, and an opponent of the Vietnam War, he suggested that change could occur from within the political system. Yet on June the 5th, 1968, shortly after winning the Californian primary, he too was assassinated.
He did represent hope, and even to people who hadn't necessarily invested in it, they knew him to be that. And the robbery was felt very strongly throughout the youth culture.
Those two assassinations did more to destroy optimism than anything else in my lifetime. And of course, really, it was three assassinations in the minds of us who came of age in the 60s, because it was John Kennedy, and then it was King, and then it was Bobby Kennedy. So those were the three most horrifying events of my youth.
The main thing, I think, when you think back on that period was just how saturated with violence the culture was. The idea of putting any kind of hope in any of these figures was beginning to look faintly ridiculous, because so many of them were being killed, violently in front of our eyes.
And for the counterculture, the idea of peace and love lost its allure, and revolution became their rallying cry. Many of those involved in the youth movement solely for the sex, drugs, and rock and roll now became politically active. And this reached its boiling point at a mass demonstration at the Democratic National Convention in August 1968.
Well, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago shaped up to be a coronation of Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president and hand-picked successor that nobody cared one whit about. And the sort of National Council of unaffiliated hippies, who called themselves the Yippies, determined to create a diversion, a strike, a demonstration outside the convention headquarters. And they called on youth all over the country to descend on Chicago. The fact is, Chicago was run by a mayor, tough guy named Richard Daley, and he just didn't see any reason these kids should be allowed to do anything. So it was a battle in the streets outside the Democratic Convention. There were thousands of kids getting clobbered and tear gassed and hauled off to jail by the Chicago police, who were acting for all intents and purposes like a Nazi police festival in the 30s.
The police riots at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968 were absolutely a dividing line. It totally radicalized youth culture. One of the chants of the protesters at the Chicago Convention was, "The whole world is watching." And that there was that sense of, once you've seen this, you can't look away, you can't unsee it, you can't pretend. You had to line up on one side or another.
Just as these images of vicious police brutality were being broadcast worldwide, the Rolling Stones released the single Street Fighting Man, inspired by the Grosvenor Square riots earlier that year. Declared a subversive record, it was instantly banned by radio stations in Chicago and reinforced the group's anti-establishment credentials.
Street Fighting Man captured the feeling of the time, both in America and here. But Jagger was always good at sensing that. He always had that ability. It was one of his strengths as a songwriter.
Everywhere I hear the sound of Martin George beat, boy. 'Cause summer's here and the time is right for fighting in the street, boy.
Blood was running in the streets. The temperatures were rising really fast. It had changed so much in that year, from All You Need Is Love in 1967, Street Fighting Man in 1968.
Timing is everything, and to have that song come out at that moment made them right at the center of the zeitgeist in a way that they probably hadn't been for several years before. And it's true that the absolute peak of the Beatles was with Sgt. Pepper's in 1967, although we have to remember that Hey Jude was also in 1968. And Dylan's most powerful political stuff was by 1968 behind him. So yeah, I would say that the Rolling Stones at that moment were probably the most powerful political force in the rock and roll scene.
And the Stones' resurgence was confirmed at the close of the year with the album Beggar's Banquet. Promoted with a drunken press party, it was a time for celebration, with not only Jagger and Richards, but also Brian Jones having narrowly avoided prison time during a difficult year. Yet the wider counterculture was not feeling so celebratory, with the presidential election of Republican candidate Richard Nixon in November pouring salt on the wounds that had been inflicted during 1968. The Stones' new LP and its standout opening track, Sympathy for the Devil, demonstrated their continued relevance and resistance to the existing order.
Anyone who had doubts about what the Stones were up to after Satanic Majesty's request had those doubts erased by Beggar's Banquet. If you watch the footage of the movie they made with, Jean-Luc Godard, they're recording Sympathy for the Devil, and in the course of making the movie, you see Jagger having to change the lyrics from "I shouted out who killed Kennedy" to "I shouted out who killed the Kennedys."
I watch with glee while you kings and queens fall for tender gaze, for the God's sake, babe. I shouted out, kill the Kennedys. Well, after all, it was you and me.
When you have to make a revision like that, you know that you're operating right on the cutting edge of what's going on. As the track that announced Beggar's Banquet, it couldn't possibly have been a stronger statement.
Pleased to meet you. Hope you guess my name.
Jagger married a hedonism to an enjoyment of that sort of Lord of Misrule role. That's what comes across in songs like Sympathy for the Devil. He falls in love, I think, with this role of the Lord of Misrule, bringing chaos and turbulence in its wake. And it's very attractive, but equally rather dangerous at the same time.
While the Stones were busy re-establishing themselves in this anarchic role, another scene had developed in Britain over the past 2 years. Inspired by the San Francisco psychedelic acts, the bands of the underground had also experimented with light shows and elongated song forms at the circuit's main club, UFO. In 1968, the scene's leading lights, the Pink Floyd, headlined the first major free concert in London's Hyde Park, organised by Black Hill Enterprises. And following the success of the first show, in June 1969, they staged an even larger event, featuring the supergroup Blind Faith.
Pink Floyd show was seminal because there was a whole lot of people at it, but it was kind of small key. We didn't promote it viciously, as it were, but the Blind Faith show was seminal insofar as they were a kind of amalgam of Cream and Traffic, with two huge bands. So they played in Hyde Park. There's 150,000 people at that. Nobody got arrested. There were no fights. It was a beautiful day. It was very kind of fey and woodland in a kind of English way.
And Sam Cutler was then contacted by the Rolling Stones. Riding high after their commercial success the previous year, they felt that a large free concert with added underground kudos would offer a suitably high-profile return to the live arena. In May, they had also fired the unreliable Brian Jones and had a new guitarist in tow, Mick Taylor, for whom this concert would provide the perfect introduction. A date was set for July, anticipation running high for the event. And then, 2 days before the show, they received news that Jones had been found dead.
A few days before the show, Brian died. So the question, of course, immediately becomes in situations like that, well, what do you do, Well, there is, of course, in the music business, and like all theatrical enterprises, there's a show must go on thing. And Mick and Keith basically felt that it should be held as a memorial to Brian.
Black Hill Enterprises started it off with very much the hippie bands playing Pink Floyd, Tyrannosaurus Rex, and then Blind Faith a bit bigger. The Stones is a different thing again. They hadn't played for a couple of years, not since the busts, or so much had happened. And they came out, they released the Butterflies, which promptly died. Not a great omen.
I thought it was one of the most awful concerts I've seen the Rolling Stones perform. I mean, they were under-rehearsed. Mick Taylor just didn't know whether he was coming or going all the way through it. Jagger dancing on dead butterflies was probably the most awfully comedic thing I've ever seen. And they were just so terribly sad, It's a shame they felt they had to do it.
Outside of the performance itself, the concert was a major event, bringing together an audience of over 250,000 who were oblivious to the Stones' failings on stage. In its communal atmosphere, it echoed the peaceful unity of the San Francisco events it was emulating. And in an homage to the renowned Golden Gate Park shows, security was overseen by a very British version of the Hells Angels.
Everyone was impeccably behaved. Nobody went to hospital, no one was stabbed, no one was shot, any of that. And there were these guys that rode BSA 125 motorcycles, which was like one step up from a scooter, who called themselves Hells Angels, and of course had nothing whatsoever to do with the American Hells Angels.
The Hells Angels in England, they weren't California Hells Angels. They had their colors drawn on their leathers in chalk. And they were backstage at the Hyde Park concert serving tea. So if that's what the Rolling Stones thought the Hells Angels were, they were in for quite severe surprise.
And soon the Stones would come face to face with the real Hells Angels. Following the Hyde Park concert, the band were making plans for a new tour, something they desperately needed to organize. Despite their resurgence in the mainstream, the band members themselves were broke. Back in 1965, manager Andrew Oldham had brought New York accountant Alan Klein into the Stones team. And over time, this tough negotiator had proven his worth to the band. Soon muscling Oldham out of the picture, by 1968, he was the band's sole manager, and his company, ABCO, had control over their financial affairs and their collective bank accounts. And getting Klein to release their funds was proving increasingly difficult.
They were fed up with Alan Klein because they could never get any money out of Alan. So here they were, this world-famous band, virtually starving, and they had to do a tour of America. Basically, they knew that if they did it with Alan Klein would end up with the lion's share of the receipts, and they'd do this huge tour and have no money. So they managed, I don't know quite how, to seduce Alan Klein's nephew, Ronnie Schneider, away from his uncle's company, ABCO, to come and work for the Stones and do that tour.
In August, I left my uncle. A few weeks after that, I got a phone call from Mick Jagger saying, "We want you to do this tour." And I told them that I had left ABCO, and they said, "Well, we know." And I said, "You have to get my uncle's permission so that I can go. I don't want to have a family problem here." So they said they would get his permission, and what they actually did was, that was the first time I heard from Sam Cutler, what they did was they brought him over to the UK and fired him.
In firing Klein, the band's assets were immediately frozen, and the run of American shows became even more crucial for their financial survival. And at the end of the summer, while preparations for the tour were underway, a major figure from the West Coast scene arrived in London. And from here, the seeds of the free concert were sown.
What happened was that the manager of one of the managers of the Grateful Dead was a guy called Rock Scully, lovely man. He came to London, and a dear friend of his was the head of Epic Records, a guy called Chesley Millican in London. And Chesley Millican, in turn, was good friends with Keith and Mick. So he introduced Rock Scully from the Grateful Dead to Keith and Mick. And Rock basically was a great proselytizer for the benefits of free concerts, how wonderful it was, what was going on in San Francisco.
Rock is summoned over to Keith Richards' house, and Rock says, you know, you guys coming over to the United States, you need to play the free concert in the Golden Gate Park. I know exactly how to do that. I can fix you up. But then they also talk about how the Stones should play the Taj Mahal. And all kinds of crazy ideas come up. And, you know, Rock leaves there without really thinking that he had just offered to set up a concert for the Rolling Stones in San Francisco. But Keith remembered.
And the prospect of headlining another free concert in the heartlands of the counterculture soon became even more appealing. In the middle of August, the 3-day Woodstock Festival became a landmark event, bringing together 32 musical acts and an audience of nearly 500,000. Despite the previous year's struggles and the election of Richard Nixon, this peaceful, harmonious event proved that the counterculture was united and thriving.
The counterculture was in very healthy condition in 1969, and Woodstock was the high tide in a way. I think in 1969 we genuinely thought we were winning. We thought we were growing and we were an unstoppable force. You know, I was a teenager at the time, and that's certainly how I felt, however naive that may sound today. But I think the view that I held was one that was widely held, that we were going to change the world. We genuinely believed that. And in 1969, we didn't think anything could stop us.
In late October 1969, the Stones team arrived in Los Angeles, looking to secure at least 15 venues for the upcoming tour, but with no plans whatsoever for a free concert. On November the 7th, at Colorado State University, the band took to an American stage for the first time in 3 years. But as with the Hyde Park show, as a live group, they were still rusty.
It showed up in their first show how woefully ill-prepared they were for the tour. And just before that show, I was asked to introduce them, right? And I didn't even think about what I was going to say, but a minute before the show, I rushed on stage and went, "The greatest rock and roll band in the world, the Rolling Stones." Everyone cheered, the band came out and played. At the end of the show, Mick came off stage, and as he walked off stage and passed me, he went, "I want to talk to you," not looking very happy. So we went into the dressing room all on our own, and he looked at me and said, "Man, don't call us the greatest rock and roll band in the world. It's embarrassing, right?" To which I replied, "Well, either you are or you ain't." They immediately went back into rehearsal. They got the sound stage for They Shoot Horses, Don't They, that film on Warner Brothers lot in Burbank in California, and they rehearsed solidly.
And from the next show onwards, the Stones proved that they were the greatest rock and roll band in the world. As they moved west from Los Angeles to Texas, Alabama to New York's Madison Square Gardens, they improved with every show. Alongside the writer Stanley Booth, who was one of the Stones' inner circle, New York Times journalist Michael Lydon was able to witness firsthand the band's remarkable ascension.
I was embedded in the tour. I never paid for a hotel room. I never paid for an airplane ticket. I was just part of the entourage. And as you can imagine, this was a plum assignment. This was extremely groovy. I remember thinking Stanley and I would look at each other while the Stones were on stage and we were behind the amps. It would go like, you know, sort of a funny look between each other, you know, realizing where we are right now is where every hippie anywhere in the world wants to be, you know, right in the band with the Rolling Stones. And it was great fun. They were red hot, and then they've been crossing the country, and they had been getting better and better and better.
In 1969, the Stones were incredible. I mean, they were just masterful. I remember when the lights were down and all you could see were the red lights on their amplifiers in Madison Square Garden in the dark. And I remember thinking, like, God, like in just a few seconds, the Rolling Stones are going to be performing right here. Like, I remember how thrilling that felt. And they were great.
I saw the Stones on that tour at the Los Angeles Forum. I had tickets for the second show, which was supposed to start at 11. It started at 2. The Stones got on stage at 4, and they then proceeded to put on what was the greatest rock and roll show I had ever seen at that point in my life, and to this day, 50 years later, remains one of the greatest rock and roll shows I've ever seen. They were unbelievable.
But while they were putting on one explosive show after another, behind the scenes, plans were developing for a West Coast free concert.
We played in Oakland and all the Grateful Dead people showed up at that show. And that kind of ball that had been started in London about wouldn't it be great if you guys played a free concert with the Grateful Dead slowly kind of accelerated, and it became the case that somebody from the Rolling Stones had to go out to California and meet with the people from the Grateful Dead and get serious about whether this was possible. So I was chosen to go there.
Rock Scully's original plan was to get a permit for a concert by the Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead, and then 24 hours before the show announce we've got a special guest. And they talked about having the Hells Angels create a escort guard to bring the Stones from the airport into the concert. That was the idea. It could have been fantastic. The Rolling Stones, right? You know? But the people in charge of the Rolling Stones business strategies began to think like this is getting to be too valuable an opportunity. Rather quickly, the Rolling Stones management in the form of Ronnie, Schneider, and a strange guy named John James, who attached himself to the Stones, they took control of this situation. We'll handle this, and contacted the mayor of San Francisco, and that was not a good idea. That ended any prospect of getting that concert in San Francisco.
Applying directly for permits for a concert in Golden Gate Park, the Stones team set alarm bells ringing in the mayor's office. The Grateful Dead had envisaged a less high-profile event with deals made behind the scenes, but the idea of 300,000 Stones fans descending on a city ill-equipped for such a large festival immediately shut the idea down. Now a new location was needed, with little time to arrange it. And while alternatives were being considered, the involvement of the Hells Angels became official.
Rock told me we'd need the Angels, right, to guard the generators. There's no electricity there, so what you did was you had to hire in big generators, produce enough electricity to do the sound and lights and all that stuff. And I went to meet the Hells Angels, and the Hells Angels went to at some length to explain that they weren't cops. Basically, they were happy to sit by the generators and stop people messing with the generators, for sure, because they love music too, you know. The idea initially was that they would park their bikes in front of the stage. The beauty of that would be that no one would, you know, rush the stage or whatever. That was the theory.
While these plans developed, renowned documentary filmmakers, the Maysles brothers, were brought on board the tour to capture the Madison Square Garden shows and the subsequent free concert. And during their New York leg, the Stones themselves made a return to the show on which they had so famously shocked America back in 1964. They had gone full circle, yet as a voice of their generation, they were more relevant than ever.
They appeared on Ed Sullivan's show 5 years after the first appearance. Now, what a difference. They're playing Gimme Shelter, this song that really symbolises so much of what is going on at that time, the tumult in the culture. They've got such great reach. They're a pop band, they're a rock band. They're on Ed Sullivan doing Gimme Shelter, which is a very subversive, angry, dark song. Rape, murder, it's just a shot away. What is round the corner? We're coming to the end of a decade. Things are looking pretty bleak socially. Musically, they were probably, reaching a new kind of peak. Had the Stones done a better song than Gimme Shelter? I'm not sure. It's an amazing piece. This isn't pop as we know it. That's the Stones really on top.
On November 28th, riding high on the critical acclaim for their performances and aware that in the music world they were the biggest news in America, they held a press conference to publicly announce the upcoming free concert.
I read in one of the papers that you'll be giving a free concert in San Francisco.
We are doing a free concert in San Francisco.
When?
On December 6th. And the location is not Golden Gate Park, unfortunately, but it's somewhere adjacent to it, which is a bit larger.
Not just a Stones show, the lineup included the biggest names from the West Coast scene, from the Grateful Dead and the Jefferson Airplane to Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Yet a location was still not confirmed, with Dick St. John's Sears Point Raceway the most likely alternative to Golden Gate Park.
They said, Ron, would you come out and negotiate a deal with Sears Point Raceway? So I flew out to San Francisco. I sat down with Dick St. John, and he basically said, well, your free concert, we need $100,000 to clean everything up. We need $100,000 to cover a $10 million cover insurance policy. Give me another reason why you need money, and then also we need any rights to a film. So I said, first of all, it's a free concert. We're not paying you $300,000. So that deal blew up.
It was 2 days before the event, and the Stones team was now desperate. And at that point, a new location was offered to them. The Altamont Speedway, 60 miles east of San Francisco, was a remote racetrack located amidst the rolling hills of Alameda County. Owned by ex-racing driver Dick Carter, it was an unlikely candidate for a major rock festival.
Dick Carter, his biggest audience ever before was he had 6,000 people show up for a demolition derby. It's Thursday afternoon, and the Stones people don't know exactly what to do, but they got to look at it. So they get a traffic helicopter from one of the local radio stations, and they take Rock Scully and Michael Lang, the producer of Woodstock, who showed up for some reason, and they fly over to Altamont. Rock looks out and he sees oil-stained asphalt, broken glass everywhere, just this horrible panorama. And he's looking out there going, what the heck? And he hears Michael Lang go, this is perfect, we can do this here.
And like that, Altamont had a green light. With only a day to prepare the venue, the road crew rushed to set up this new site. The Stones team had already begun building the stage and organizing the lighting rig at Sears Point, and this was simply dismantled and re-erected at Altamont. There was no time to properly evaluate or rethink the original plans, although upon his arrival, tour manager Sam Cutler immediately had concerns.
The major problem was that the stage that had been perfect for Sears Point because it was going to be on the side of the hill was now at the bottom of a hill, and the stage was knee-high. So it was effortlessly easy for people to get on it. The show was on a Saturday. I saw the place midday on Friday for the first time and was horrified. And there was already 100,000 odd people on site. And this stage was isolated in the middle of them, right? So we tried to make barricades of trucks and stuff around it and get set up for a show. And I knew on the Friday this was going to be a massive, massive public order problem.
The show went ahead. With no food or water stands, no amenities of any kind, and only basic medical services on site, the 300,000 concert-goers who flocked to the venue had no idea what was awaiting them. It was the very end of the 60s, the last mass congregation of the counterculture before a new decade began. This should have been a celebration.
The sun came up, it was sort of a gray day, and then at some point they sort of officially let people in, and this mob of young people came rushing down the hill with the blankets and trying to grab themselves, you know, a tiny little space to sit. And the mood was definitely cheerful and fun and like, yes, this is going to be like Woodstock. This is groovy. I couldn't make it to Woodstock, but I'm here.
But it did not take long for the atmosphere to change.
The problem was there was a lot of LSD, bad acid, bad drugs, lots of cheap booze. So by the time the show opened at midday on the Saturday, you had 300,000-400,000 people completely out of it. And the fights began, and it just degenerated from there.
With the Hells Angels a visible presence around the stage and throughout the festival grounds, at midday the first act appeared, Santana. Halfway through the performance, San Francisco peace activist and promoter Bert Kangerson was the first of many victims to face the wrath of the concert's brutal security force.
This overweight Latino, stark naked, whipped out of his brains on LSD that was probably laced with methadone and guzzling Red Mountain wine. He wanders down the hill into the front of the stage where the Hells Angels are, and I mean, this is just like bad news right away. And Bert sees this happening, and he jumps down, and he starts in on this all men are brothers, you know, and begging the Angels not to beat this guy. They turn on Bert, and they rain pool cues down on him. They bust him up so good, he has 60 stitches in his head.
It was just the beginning. The Angels' presence on the stage and at the front of the audience increased, and as the Jefferson Airplane took their places for the second performance, it was hard to distinguish the band from the bikers. More of the crowd was singled out for beatings, and when the Airplane's lead singer Marty Balin tried to intervene, he too was attacked.
These guys were the real thing. They weren't the little biking club that they had at Hyde Park. They've got psychopaths and murderers and ex-cons and God knows what in there. They're bad news.
Yeah, it's all right. It's kind of weird up here.
Hey, man, I'd like to mention that the Hells Angels just smashed Marty Balin in the face and knocked him out for a bit. I'd like to thank you for that.
There's other ways.
Wait, is this on? You're talking to me, I'm going to talk to you.
I'm not talking to you, man. I'm talking to the people that hit my lead singer in the head.
You're talking to my people.
Right.
Now, let me tell you what's happening.
Man,
What's happening? Hey! Oh!
No!
Hold it.
No!
This was scary. This was scary and sort of rationally scary. We weren't inventing it. We were seeing real ugliness and hurtfulness and savagery right in front of our eyes. The Hells Angels were horrible. And it seemed almost more so because over the past decade, there had been a kind of a myth about how cool they were.
Really important to understand. The San Francisco chapter of the Hells Angels was located in the Haight-Ashbury. They were well known backstage at Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane concerts. They rode bikes with the road crews. They were an entirely different group of Hells Angels than, say, the home office over in Oakland. The problems with the Hells Angels at the eventual site of the concert at Altamont were all in front of the stage, and they were almost entirely caused by members of the San Jose chapter. The San Jose chapter was entirely different That's an hour away from San Francisco. They're not hippies. They're not used to going to the Fillmore. They're not backstage presences. They are old-fashioned California thugs, and those were the guys in front of the stage with the pool cues.
Although they were there to capture a positive end to the Stones' tour, the Maysles brothers and their cameramen were now documenting the escalating chaos. And it was the Stones' tour manager, Sam Cutler, who attempted to restore order.
In many ways, I felt essentially helpless. In the face of people who are determined to fight one another, what can a skinny little Englishman do? And as the day progressed and the violence got worse, I was faced with this dreadful realization that my band was going to come. The Rolling Stones were going to come and were going to have to appear here.
And in the early afternoon, as the Flying Burrito Brothers began the third set of the festival, the Stones arrived on the Speedway track by helicopter. And almost immediately, they were met with violence.
Mick arrived, and the rest of the Stones, minus Bill Wyman, and the first thing that happened was he stepped out of the helicopter and some deranged kid on acid punched him.
They hit Mick. Somebody hit him.
So that was frightening. And Mick arrived and got reports from people about how dreadful the whole thing was.
We were all put in a little trailer. So at the beginning, I'm sure we got stories that some violence, but we didn't see any of it and know what was going on. But you can sense that there was, I don't know if it's in situations other places, but you can feel it in the air.
And this ominous mood was enough to convince local headliners, the Grateful Dead, to abandon the concert altogether. Arriving soon after the Stones, only to discover that members of their road crew had already been assaulted by angels, they decided to bail. The band who had pioneered the very idea of the free concert wanted no part of this event.
The bottom line was the Grateful Dead ran. They backed out of it. They didn't, they saw there was too much violence. If they would have performed, I think it might have been a whole different ball game, as opposed to saying, oh, the Stones. If the Grateful Dead had performed their 2 or 3 hour set, I'm sure it would have mellowed everybody. It might put everybody to sleep eventually. They were doing all the drugs and all that. But the end result was they ran. So now you had that lag time before the Stones came out and all the bad drugs, the violence and all that stuff going on there. But the Stones still came out and performed. They didn't run.
Following the Dead's departure, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young played as brief a set as they could manage, the beatings by the Angels continuing throughout their performance. After only half an hour, they quickly exited the stage and immediately fled Altamont. Now there was only the Stones left to play, and in the absence of the Grateful Dead, their headline set wasn't due to start for hours.
The crowd just sits there. They've been there all day. There's no water, there's no bathrooms, there's no food. They're jammed in, hip to hip, shoulder to shoulder, and they're there for more than 2 hours with nothing going on. Just as the sun starts to go down, Sonny Barger in the Oakland chapter shows up. They'd had a meeting that afternoon, and they literally did just drive right through the crowd down to the front of the stage, park their bikes, get off and stand on the stage. It was an amazing display.
And once darkness had fallen, the Stones finally took to the stage. Outnumbered by the hordes of angels all around them, as they kicked off their set, they managed to rise above the unsettling atmosphere.
The Stones played out of their skin, and quite probably out of fear, because by this time, the Hells Angels are all over the stage, and if they'd stopped playing, they might not even have got out alive. And under duress, and with that kind of adrenaline flowing, they put on one hell of a performance.
It's just phenomenal. Just Charlie and Wyman had the bottom locked down. The guitars were going off like sparks. And Jagger was singing like he meant it, like none of that sort of loopy caricature that he tends to go to. He was for real about this thing.
But this impressive performance could not suppress the brutality that would soon disrupt their set. And although later some of the band claimed they were unable to see the full extent of the violence, the cameras filming the events on and around the stage captured a concert descending into chaos.
Things just went from bad to worse, and really, there was no control in it. There was fights everywhere. People rushing the stage, being thrown off the stage, fights in front of the stage. We were more than aware of what was going on.
All the light is backlight, 50,000 watts of backlight, bright as your living room. So all this stuff about the Rolling Stones didn't know what was happening and didn't see what was happening is complete and utter bullshit. And you can see in the movie where Jagger's like dancing around and his eyes happens out in the audience and you see somebody take a blow from a pool cue and he just goes, boom, stops dancing.
Jagger has so much command as a performer, and to see him struggling, it's terrifying.
Come on, let's get it together. I can't do any more than just ask you, to beg you, just to keep it together. You can do it, it's within your power, everyone. Everyone, Hell's Angels, everybody.
At that point, certainly, you know, bands like the Jefferson Airplane and the Rolling Stones, they were avatars, they were gods. And to see them desperate to try to stop this violence happening right in front of them and failing, you know, it's unforgettable.
You could see it etched in people's faces at the front of the stage, just looking at Jagger and say, please, you know, stop, you know, help us out. This is, we're watching everything dying here. And in between the songs, you had these deathly silences and then sort of the sound of cracked heads and people shouting no and wanting everything to stop. The brotherhood of man thing, which, you know, was the hippie dream, it was all coming really unstuck there very, very badly.
I was right behind the amps, so I could only see what I could see. But at some point, Keith, just like Marty Balin, Keith stopped and said, hey, you can't do this here, and the music stopped.
Look, Cat, that guy there, if he doesn't stop it, man. Listen, either those cats call it, man, or we don't play.
But then there was some kind of another one of these attacks, and you could just tell it was just awful. And people were, they looked like if you were a fish in a bowl and you dropped a pebble in, and all the fish would scurry as fast as they could have. That was like there was the center place where something really ugly was happening, and people were just trying to get away as fast as they possibly could. I left. I just walked. Left the stage and sort of walked away up this little hill. Then I realized I'm not coming to any more of these things. I'm not going to sort of believe the Woodstock, Monterey Pop, human being myth anymore. The Hells Angels were a huge mistake. I mean, it's just not all brothers and sisters. That there's elements of ugliness and viciousness and hurtfulness that are too powerful for that.
And the viciousness unleashed at the concert culminated in murder. 18-year-old student Meredith Hunter, caught up in a brawl with the Angels in front of the stage, made the mistake of pulling a gun on his assailants. He would not live to see the end of the Stones set.
Finally, they're doing Under My Thumb, and a guy pulled out a gun, got 2 shots off, maybe 60 feet in front of the stage, and was stabbed to death by one of the Hells Angels. The band stopped.
All of a sudden I got told, Ron, we need the ambulance, a guy's been stabbed. So that's what I was told. So I started running to go to the side of the stage to get the ambulance, and as I'm running along there, I get to the end, and there's no driver. Typical situation. I'm screaming for the driver, and I'm running along there. Where's the driver to the ambulance to get him for them? And the cop says, oh, wait, are you about that guy that got stabbed? I said, yeah. He says, you don't have to run, he's dead. And that was like a gut, that was it. That was so bad at the time, you know.
And although the footage was never released in the Maysles brothers' film Gimme Shelter, in the years following the event, eyewitness accounts reported that Hunter's body was brought to the stage by members of the audience in an attempt to end the Angels' violence.
I talked to the guys that carried his body to the stage, and I talked to the guy who carried his body from the stage backstage. And they put it on the stage right in front of Keith Richardson. The Hells Angels swarmed over it and just pushed it back off. There's a photograph of that. There's a photograph of Mick Jagger looking away with his hand over his face like this, and a bunch of Hells Angels bent over us mysteriously in the corner. Yeah, they just dropped a dead body on your stage, and they're pushing it off. What are you gonna do about that, fellas? They're gonna stay on stage for another hour. Terrified.
I whispered to Mick, a guy's being killed, man. You gotta get off stage right now, right? He had a gun, you gotta get off stage. To which Mick replied, and kudos to the man, you know, and I've always admired him for it. We can't get off stage. We can't leave. We have to finish the show.
When the Stones eventually boarded a helicopter and left Altamont, they were shell-shocked. Due to fly out for a number of European shows the next day, their schedule didn't allow them time to fully grasp the magnitude of the event they had just experienced. In the days that followed, where some news reports glossed over the violence of the festival, slowly the facts began to emerge. And alongside the arrests of cult leader Charles Manson and his murderous followers only days beforehand, soon Altamont was being identified as an event of real historical significance.
Well, Altamont is always the thing that's cited as being the end of the sort of flower power era, if you like, the hippie era, and I think it's certainly a signpost. I think it was downhill all the way after that. Murder does tend to concentrate the mind a little.
I don't think the Stones realised the significance or the impact of Altamont until long after. I think most of us didn't. You know, this is the famous Chow En-lai thing when asked in about 1950 about the impact of the French Revolution on the subsequent course of history, and he said it was too early to say. So Altamont is a sort of rock and roll equivalent of that in a way. No one knew in December '69 or even by summer 1970 that it was going to go down in rock history as this seminal moment, this turning point, this tipping point.
The hard truths that those events represent about how hard change is to achieve, and you know what violence in American culture represents, and how it can manifest itself even in contexts where you would think would be the last place it would occur. Those were important lessons, and those were lessons that signaled, guess what? We're not going back to the garden. That became pretty apparent. I don't think anybody was, walking around with flowers in their hair after all that.
A new equilibrium was found, and actually, very quickly, people almost thought, did that late 60s, what happened then? What really happened? The negative out-punched the good there, unfortunately, and people wanted to distance themselves from that. So the 70s, there was kind of a marked break. The flower stuff seemed just an absolute joke. I saw Monterey Pop in 1975, and the audience laughed. They laughed at the look, the sound, everything. I was horrified by that. It's the 60s. To me, I hung on to the good part of the 60s, It had really been put to bed, that period. People didn't want to know, It kind of quickly became the forgotten zone. And Altamont and the Manson murders were instrumental, really, in closing that door.
And although the Stones moved ever onwards with their career, the event also closed a door for them too. The bad boys of the British invasion would never again be at the centre of the culture. Politics and social commentary notably absent from their subsequent work. Their remarkable reign as the voice of a generation was over.
There's the Rolling Stones before Altamont, and there's the Rolling Stones after Altamont. It's just two separate things. All that stuff about the dark guys and the bad boys and the sympathy for the devil had played out to this absolute, real example of evil. And having faced that, they could never go back to their little pretend kingdom. And you can see that in the Sticky Fingers album. The three songs recorded before Altamont, Brown Sugar, Wild Horses, and You Got to Move, are a completely different type of music than the rest of that album. Whatever happened at Altamont to the Rolling Stones, it changed them forever. And their music was never the same, their shows were never the same, their personal relations were never the same. Nothing about their lives went on the way it was before.